My name's Michael Madry, and I am a former quality assurance manager for EMLab P&K, which is owned by TestAmerica, which in turn owned by H.I.G Capital. And what I discovered were data integrity issues, bulk and air samples suspected of containing asbestos. And asbestos is a carcinogen, causes a type of cancer called mesothelioma, the effects of which don't appear right away. It takes years to develop. And when I reported these issues to management, what happened was they first went after my supervisor, who was the National Director of Quality Assurance. And when they had him moved out of the way, they came after me. And basically, they can't defend the merits of their data on the merits. So they had to resort to what is known as a character assassination, where they basically defamed me and stressed me out to the point where I had to go on to stress leave, where I was on that for 2 years under so much stress. And during that time, I filed a complaint with the OSHA Region 9 office. And OSHA is the government agency that's responsible for investigating retaliation complaints under the whistleblower protection provisions of the various environmental acts. And what happened was Mr. Darrell Whitman was assigned to investigate my case, and he did do a proper objective investigation. And at the end of that investigation, he determined that there was reasonable cause to believe that EMLab P&K had violated the provisions of the Toxic Substances Control Act when they retaliated against me. Mr. Whitman also investigated my supervisor's complaint. My supervisor filed a complaint in April of 2010, and Mr. Whitman also determined that my supervisor's complaint had merit. In July 2011, the OSHA Washington office declared that my complaint was categorized as being significant, which I understood to mean that there was going to be a press release regarding my allegations of data falsification and wire fraud, and that there were supposed to be a substantial monetary punitive damages against my employer for doing what they did. And what happened at that point was Mr. Joshua Paul, who is the regional supervisory investigator in that office, simply sat on my complaint for more than a year without signing off on it. And then when I began to complain about the amount of time that had transpired between when Mr. Whitman turned in his merit findings and the lack of issuance of the secretary's findings, he then tried to dismiss my complaint and rewrote Mr. Whitman's findings. At that point, I contacted the Washington office, Sandra Dillon and Dr. David Michaels. I wrote them letters. I complained about what was going on in the OSHA Region 9 office. I complained about Mr. Paul. And what happened was that Dr. Michaels sent my complaint back down chain of command to Mr. Wolf, who is Mr. Paul's supervisor in the Region 9 office. And Mr. Wolf simply did a sham or biased investigation of my complaint and sent me a letter to that effect. And when I wrote Dr. Michaels, I also expressed my concerns about my employer's criminal activities, in that the data that I had should have been turned over to the Department of Justice. And Mr. Wolf simply said that it wasn't OSHA's responsibility to do that, that I would have to do that on my own.
And why did you want to turn it over to the Department of Justice?
I felt that this was a very significant risk to public health and safety, because asbestos is a carcinogen, and there were several instances where there were false negatives. What a false negative is they basically report there's no asbestos present when there actually is. and the end users of this data are using our data to make important health and safety and financial decisions on whether to remediate contaminated sites. So inadvertently, people might have been contaminated when they thought they had no asbestos, when they thought the area was clear. And I felt that these allegations needed to be investigated. Also, during my complaint process, my employer fabricated documentation. They obstructed Mr. Whitman's investigation. They tampered with a witness to the point where she, a managerial employee, went to Mr. Whitman on her own and explained that they tried to subordinate her to do perjury. And I pointed all of these issues out to Mr. Paul, and he basically failed to do any effective action in regard to my complaints.
Why do you think that David Michaels and the OSHA did not go to the FBI and the Justice Department for prosecution, since it wasn't just about you, it was about the public who might be put in danger?
Yeah, I'm really confused about that point, and my belief is that they're catering to the interest of big business. H.I.G. Capital is a very large company. They have net worth in the billions of dollars. They have very deep pockets. They have political connections with various politicians have invested in that company, and I believe they did my employer a favor. What eventually happened was they reviewed my Mr. Whitman's findings. However, they did reaffirm Mr. Whitman's merit findings of the case. However, when they rewrote Mr. Whitman's report, they really shortchanged me, and the amount of a make-whole remedy was less than the cost of the amount of damages I received. And in addition, they didn't have any punitive damages assessed against my employer, where I believe that they should have been assessed due to the egregious nature of the fabrication of the asbestos results.
And you're saying it may be a RICO case because they conspired to cover this up? How did they conspire? They conspired
to, well, my employer conspired to drive me out. They also conspired to drive my supervisor out. And like I mentioned, they obstructed a government official's investigation, fabricated evidence. They intimidated a witness in my case. And then on the government side, OSHA, I continued to complain about Mr. Paul and the supervisory personnel in that office, and I never got anybody to do a fair investigation of my complaints. It seems like they conspired to cover up their wrongdoing with regard to my case.
And you went to political representatives? Who did you go to?
Yes. I wrote letters to all of the Region 9 senators, made them aware that,
who are those?
let's see, Nevada senators. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I know my senators. I'm from Arizona, so I wrote John McCain and Jeff Flake are my two senators. I remember one of the senators from Hawaii was Senator Inouye, and then Senator Hiro, I believe.
Did any of them respond to you?
No. I also I know the senators from California, Feinstein, Boxer. I wrote them. And I explained this at OSHA after I complained about Mr. Paul, started to target Mr. Whitman, claiming that he had released information to me that he shouldn't have released. And what I found out, my case is still pending, I'm having trouble getting information related to my case file, like I put FOIA requests in for several documents that I'm missing that were exhibits in my final investigative report, and they've simply quashed my subpoena by sending it to the regional solicitor up in Seattle. can't recall the
So does
person's
David
name.
Michaels know about this, that you're not getting your information?
Yeah, because I did write David Michaels a letter in 2012 at the same time I was writing the senators. I also wrote to an individual named Rita Lucero, who was assigned to the whistleblower office in Washington, and she's the one that came out and investigated Mr. Whitman's complaint, because Mr. Whitman complained about the issues in that office regarding the supervisory personnel summarily dismissing other whistleblowers' complaints. My understanding is I'm not the only one that this has happened to. There are several other people that I know about, that I've talked to, that I've exchanged information with, that said they've had the same thing happen to them by the individuals in that Region 9 office. One individual told me his case was sitting so long that he withdrew it and took it into federal court on his own.
And H.I.G. Capital, are you saying that they were engaged in a criminal conspiracy to falsify tests to increase their profits?
Yeah, my belief is they were putting production and efficiency above quality in order to make a profit, and that's what they do. They basically buy these companies and they try to make them more efficient so they can get as much profit out of them for their investors as they can. So they're at least an accessory to what was going on, since they own TestAmerica and EMLab P&K.
And they also tried to slander you?
Yeah, they made accusations that I'm mentally unstable, because they basically stressed me out to the point where I was going to have a nervous breakdown. And then they used a technique called a mental health trap, where they claim you're mentally unstable because of all the stress they caused you. And then they forced me to have a psychiatric evaluation by one of their employee assistance program personnel, who diagnosed me with what's called adjustment disorder, which is a form of post-traumatic stress syndrome, which the individual was a PhD psychologist and attributed to the harassment that I witnessed against my supervisor and the harassment that I received from my employer.
Do you think that there should be criminal penalties against companies, employers who retaliate against whistleblowers, health and safety whistleblowers?
I do. I think there should be a federal investigation of H.I.G. Capital and TestAmerica's results. I brought these issues up to the EPA, and once again, the EPA seems to have sat on my case and taken no action.
Now, the Environmental Protection Agency, don't you think they would be concerned about falsification of tests and all these toxic dump sites and asbestos?
Yeah, because they're the ones that are supposed to regulate or enforce the provisions of these environmental statutes.
And who did you talk to at EPA?
I talked to an individual called Bloomfeld, who's the regional administrator at EPA. I sent him all of the data I had. I sent him all of my OSHA secretary's findings, and basically I was told they didn't have the resources to do the investigation. So what happened was they turned it over to the EPA Office of Inspector General up on Hawthorne Street to an individual named Victoria Schwartz, and she simply sat on my complaint and took no action. I was especially concerned because my employer in 2009 had placed a bid for work at the Hunters Point Superfund site, which you have to have a certain accreditation. It's called a Department of Defense accreditation for the laboratory in order to perform that type of work, and they didn't have that accreditation. And I'm unsure as to whether or not they received samples from Hunters Point for asbestos, and I pointed that out to Ms. Schwartz, and I asked her I said, this is something that needs to be investigated, because I saw a NBC investigative reports show from NBC Bay Area that indicated that other subcontractors at that site had fabricated data in order to clear the site and free it up for development.
So do you think behind this is big money?
Yeah,
billionaires, these developers?
I believe all these government agencies they're corrupt. It's institutional. It seems to be institutionalized, and they're catering to the interest of big business. It seems to come down to money.
And what do you think people should do who want to support you?
I think they should write their senators. I think they should go down to H.I.G. Capital and ask, what's going on. I think they should go up to EMLab P&K has a laboratory in San Bruno, 1150 Bay Hill Drive, Suite 100. They should go up there and they should ask Dr. Kamash Ramanathan, who is the laboratory director there, how is it possible to do an asbestos test in 20 seconds when an expert government witness has written a statement in my case stating that the average time for a sample that has no interferences takes 6 to 10 minutes.
How many labs does this company have around the United States?
They currently have 12 labs, and I believe 8 of them are accredited by the National Voluntary Laboratory Accreditation Program to perform analyses of bulk samples suspected of containing asbestos. They're also accredited by what's known as the American Industrial Hygiene Association. That's a third-party accreditor that basically goes in and audits labs and says they're competent to perform tests. They have accredited several of the EMLab P&K labs to do analyses of suspected samples in the air that contain asbestos.
And they've tried to hide from these accrediting agencies what they're actually doing, these computer data.
What I discovered, the National Voluntary Laboratory Accreditation Program is an agency that oversees the licensing of these labs for asbestos. And one of their requirements in order to get accreditation is that labs are prohibited from using computerized devices that provide a set of default optical properties data for asbestos. The optical properties data is the data that confirms or denies whether asbestos is present. And they had received a previous deficiency in 2006 for doing this. They corrected the deficiency, and then they switched to what is known as a speed pad or a game pad, which is used in computer games. And you simply the game pad contains what are known as macros, and they can be pre-programmed to enter a default set of optical properties data into their limb system, and that's what they were using to supposedly increase their efficiency in the testing process. And what happened was one of the analysts at the San Bruno lab sent me an email prior to an external audit by NevLab suggesting that we hide these speed pad devices from the auditor when he came in to do his audit because of the fact they had a previous deficiency.
And is the government aware of this?
Yeah, it's part of the data I supplied to the EPA, I supplied to Victoria Schwartz. I also was part of my documentation of my complaint with OSHA.
So they know that they're basically fraudulently doing tests.
Yeah, they knowingly continued to use this device when it was pointed out that people were getting, clients were receiving false negatives, false positives, and misidentified asbestos types. And they never went, when I flagged these samples for what's called a quality assurance review, they never performed an investigation to find out the cause of the errors. They just continued to, what I believe, negligently use this device and put our whole nation at risk.
And they talk about national security, homeland security. Isn't this part of homeland security? I mean, the protection of the American people.
Yeah, I would imagine that it would fall under that category. And I also feel that this is a RICO case because of all of the conspiracy that went on, the obstruction, the mail fraud, the fabrication of data, the lying to government investigators, intimidation of witnesses, and also the cover-up that was done by OSHA.
And you came to San Francisco to visit, to get some depositions, but also you met some people here who were working at Hunters Point. What did they tell you when you met them? They
were afraid for their health and safety because of what was going on there.
And one of them thanked you for...
Yeah, several of them that are PhDs thanked me for coming forth and doing the right thing. I felt I did the right thing at the right time for the right, but obviously it came at a price for me because the government did not do what they were supposed to do in protecting me as a whistleblower.
And what does that mean to other people who work at companies like yours that are trying to be conscientious in protecting the public and protecting people?
It sends a chilling effect that, if I speak up, that could happen to me as well. And they would be reluctant to come forward knowing that they didn't have the protection that should be afforded to them under these acts.
And the other workers there are probably terrified too if they say anything or
yeah.
Yeah.
There was another individual in our quality assurance department that was the most vocal. We had 3 individuals in our department, myself, my supervisor who had a PhD in microbiology, and another individual. And that other individual is the most vocal of the 3 of us, yet they never did anything against her, and she's still quality assurance manager there, as far as I know.
And you also went to the FBI and the Justice Department?
Yeah, I filed a complaint with the FBI and their fraud division, and nobody ever followed up with me and contacted me, or as far as I know, they did no investigation. And this is a serious issue here because it affects so many people's public health and safety.
You're not giving up?
No, I'm beaten, but I'm not going to give up the fight.